and welcome to the Majlis podcast, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's current affairs talk show focusing on Central Asia. I'm Bruce Pannier, host of the Majlis and author of the weekly Central Asia in Focus newsletter. Kazakhstan's relations with Russia have been strained in recent years by comments from Russian officials and public figures about some or all of Kazakhstan being historically Russian land. Those comments have been coming more frequently since Russia launched its war on Ukraine in late February. And Kazakhstan's government has said publicly several times it will not recognize the independence of the Russian-occupied Donetsk and Luhansk regions of eastern Ukraine. At the St. Petersburg Economic Forum on June 17th, Kazakh President Qasym-Zhomart Toqaev repeated this position with Russian President Vladimir Putin sitting right next to him. In his remarks, Putin said the Kremlin regards all of the territory of the former Soviet Union as being historically Russian land. Clearly, there are problems in Kazakh-Russian relations, and to discuss all this, I am joined by Nargiz Kasenova, originally from Kazakhstan, but currently a senior fellow and director of the program on Central Asia at Harvard Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. William Courtney, a former U.S. ambassador to Kazakhstan and Georgia, who is currently an adjunct senior fellow at the RAND Corporation and executive director of the RAND Business Leaders Forum. Azamat Junisbai, also originally from Kazakhstan, but currently a professor of sociology at Pitzer College in Claremont, California, whose work focuses on social stratification, welfare state attitudes, and public opinion about political and economic inequality in post-Soviet Central Asia. Thank you all for joining me. And Nargiz, I'm going to start with you, but I encourage all of you to jump in and follow up on any point that's raised during these discussions. Nargiz, I mentioned the roots of this seeming rift in Kazakh-Russian relations starting well before Russia's war on Ukraine. Could you walk us through some of the background of the problems in relations before February this year?
Thank you, Bruce. It's great to be with you. I don't think we have enough time to walk through all the kind of the historical background to all these current comments and reactions and all that. But indeed, there are tensions. There have been tensions in Kazakhstan-Russia relations, and they date back to the early days of our independence, we can recall Solzhenitsyn's, for example, article in which he was talking about northern Kazakhstan as kind of part of the historical Russia. We remember kind of these tense negotiations between the Kazakh and Russian authorities that was, under Yeltsin, about the Cossacks on the border, and there were, kind of fears of that, of the potential neo-imperialism of Russia, using the Cossacks, using the minorities, using Russian diaspora in Kazakhstan. So that has been with us for all these 3 decades. Kind of some fears of Russian neo-imperialism, a revival of Russian neo-imperialism, but they've been managed. They've been managed quite well, and both sides were careful. Particularly the Kazakh side has been quite prudent. So it's nothing new, but as you mentioned, the kind of with the change of the overall rhetoric in Russia, and kind of emphasizing Russian greatness, and with relations with the West worsening, this kind of rhetoric got more heightened, more frequent, and it's something that was definitely noticed in Kazakhstan and was causing nervous reaction. But I want to say that Toqaev gave quite a good response to these comments at the St. Petersburg Forum, and we see the kind of the reactions. The Maria Zakharova, for example, the speaker of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, she just said the other day that we respect Kazakhstan's position. And, Russian Minister of Defense, Shoigu, I think yesterday he also said that, Russia and Kazakhstan are the kind of strategic allies, and, we are cooperating. So they try to do also some damage control on the Russian side, but tensions are there, obviously.
But just to follow up on that a little bit, it's quite a dramatic turn in relations, considering that, just in January there was unrest in Kazakhstan. President Toqaev asked for and received help from the Collective Security Treaty Organization, but we all know that that's a Russian-led organization anyway, and it's that he would be in, Toqaev and Kazakhstan would be indebted somehow to Russia. And then all of a sudden we find ourselves in a situation where Kazakhstan is not openly opposing Russia, but if you read between the lines, you can see that the Kazakh government is not very happy with the situation that Russia's created in Ukraine and is not willing to blindly follow Moscow.
But I think the Kazakhstan has been consistent. I think it was a misinterpretation of what happened in January. Yeah, that Kazakhstan suddenly, kind of really got into Russia's fold. Now, it's a vessel and something, kind of Belarus-like. So that's something that's the opinion I opposed back then in January, and I think we see that it's the case that Kazakhstan had multi-vector foreign policy, and it continues to have a multi-vector foreign policy.
Ambassador Courtney, you're a veteran diplomat, and so is President Toqaev, who served as Kazakhstan's foreign minister and also representative to the UN in Geneva. There's a lot of ties that bind these two countries, one being the energy grid in the north, for example, which runs back and forth across the border between Kazakhstan and Russia. But there's even more than that. Can you give us an idea of the kind of tightrope that President Toqaev is walking at this moment?
Well, Bruce, let's make a comparison between Ukraine and Kazakhstan. Ukraine has a sea outlet and land outlet to Europe, but Kazakhstan has nothing like that. Almost all the transportation and communication routes out of Kazakhstan traditionally have gone through Russia. There has been some diversification, of course, over the last 30 years of Kazakhstan's independence with China, with the West, with Turkey. But Kazakhstan economically is still very dependent on having good relations with Russia so that railway transportation, for example, can be smooth across the area. The Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, part of that involves Chinese goods coming from central Western China through Kazakhstan, through Russia to reach Europe. So Kazakhstan has a different and more powerful incentive than, say, Ukraine to have close relations with Russia. And President Nazarbayev very skillfully managed that over the years. And now, as we see with President Toqaev, he seems to be doing so as well. It's important to underline Kazakhstan's independence and sovereignty, as President Toqaev did in St. Petersburg at Spiv. But at the same time, as President Toqaev did, keep emphasizing ways to cooperate with Russia.
What do you make of the, we heard that the port in Novorossiysk, which of course is where you mentioned a lot of connections between Kazakhstan and Russia, but the Caspian Pipeline Consortium, of course, that's the big oil exporter for Kazakhstan, and that pipeline runs to the Russian port in Novorossiysk. And shortly after Toqaev's comments, all of a sudden we hear that they won't be able to use that port temporarily because of the discovery of more than 50 mines that were left over from World War II. This port has, of course, been operating since 2001, and all of a sudden they find these more than 50, naval mines in the water. Is Russia sending a message with this?
Yes. So over the years, of course, Russia has temporarily controlled energy activities with others, including most recently reducing the volume of gas sent through Nord Stream 1 pipeline to Europe. So this is a standard part of Russian practice, and it angers consumers of Russian energy. It's likely to lead Russia to lose energy share over the long term in Europe to Russia's disadvantage. Well, this is the same kind of political interference, if you will, that Russia has done elsewhere. So it is a strict pokazuka. It's not a real issue in terms of World War II landmines.
Okay, Azamat, we'll get to you now. With all you've heard about that, the Russian irredentist claims on Kazakh land that we've heard, and the clear messages from the Kremlin that they're not happy with President Toqaev's statements last week in St. Petersburg, and more generally with Kazakhstan's posturing, not in lack of support for Russia during the war. What do you hear from people that you know about Kazakhstan about all this? I mean, is this a big topic of conversation, what they're saying in Russia and what they're doing to Kazakhstan?
Yes, there is definitely response to this, right? So Nargis mentioned that a few of the Russian officials gave very measured responses to President Toqaev's statements in St. Petersburg, but there were also much more hostile comments that invariably get more attention in Kazakhstan, right? So Konstantin Zatulin is a Russian parliament deputy responsible for affairs of the CIS, essentially threatened Kazakhstan, saying that Russia, don't have territorial claims and disputes as long as we have friendly relations. Otherwise, Kazakhstan could face measures like Ukraine, right? And so comments like that, of course, get a lot of response from people in that I think, just like Ambassador Courtney right now said, Kazakhstan is very heavily dependent on Russia economically, right? Because of just the lay of the land, geography. And those are facts that we cannot do much about. Kazakhstan also demographically has this unique situation, right? Where a lot of northern Kazakhstan has heavily Russian populations, essentially bordering Russia, right? But despite all this, it's getting to be harder and harder, even for those who would like to see things as being okay. It's getting much harder to not notice or to look away from what increasingly looks like neo-imperial ambitions, right, on part of Russia, right? And it's sort of this unabashed, sort of not afraid to show it kind of imperialism on part of Russia that I think a lot of Kazakhstan society, a lot of people in Kazakhstan are beginning to notice, right? Folks who probably were not thinking about this in their regular lives. It's just getting to be impossible to not notice this. Of course, events in Ukraine are making it very difficult to not notice this. I think very interesting, fascinating event on March 6th. There was a rally in Almaty in support of Ukraine and against the Russian aggression in Ukraine, right? And as everyone on this podcast knows, Kazakhstan does not really have a huge history of allowing rallies or mass gatherings. And this one was officially sanctioned, was allowed to go ahead, and it was really well attended. And people were able to express their opinions, express their protest, all kinds of creative signs. I personally know quite a few folks who participated. And again, it's the kind of awakening, perhaps, political awakening with regards to sort of Russia's ambitions and Russia's posturing toward Kazakhstan that's happening in Kazakhstan society now. Perhaps we'll get to this later, but one thing I also have been thinking about recently is that, of course, everyone talks about the power of Russian propaganda, right? Russian media and how it shapes hearts and minds. But it's important to think that demographically things are changing. Right now, Kazakhstan has about 17% Russian population and over 70% Kazakh population. This is dramatically different, right, from what we had in the early 90s. And it's just that the reach of Russian propaganda, reach of Russian TV, of course, is going to be limited to those who consume news and information in Russian. And in Kazakhstan, a growing number of people are going to have immunity against Russian propaganda because they are no longer consuming Russian news and information as the primary means, right? Just because demographically the situation is changing. There are, of course, lots of Russian-speaking Kazakhs, like my own family, but there is a rapidly growing number of Kazakh-speaking Kazakhs who are, I think, somewhat immune to Russian propaganda, and that's very important.
Bruce, can I add?
Yeah, please.
Yes. Okay. First, I wanted to add a bit of information on the CPC, like demining operation. It is reported that it started actually on the 16th of June. So it's on the eve of the St. Petersburg summit, which means it's not really a reaction to what Toqaev said, but there should be some linkage. We suspect that there is some kind of linkage with how Russian-Kazakh relations are at the moment. And we can also recall the earlier accident there in Novorossiysk and also the interruption of the kind of this transfer of oil, which also kind of raised a lot of suspicions in Kazakh society. Like officially that happened because of the storm and the equipment was damaged. But, whether that's the case or not, the suspicions were there because there are these tensions in the relations. And as Ambassador Courtney mentioned, there are these very kind of big dependencies that we have on Russia, and that's the transit of oil. So most of our oil goes via Russia, and it can be interrupted, under different pretexts. Clearly, our electricity system in the north is linked to the Russian electricity system. It's part of this Russian grid. And there are other, economic facets, economic dependence facets, but also we are security allies. We have a security alliance with Russia. And as Azamat mentioned, also in terms of the Russian influence on what people think, how they perceive things, we are part of the Russian information space. And only the other day it was kind of uncovered by our journalists that there are three domains that mirror popular Kazakh domains that have been publishing Russian propaganda, sort of misleading the people and so on. So all these things are going on. But I think the situation is interesting because clearly Kazakhstan is weaker than Russia in this relationship. But I think there is a sense that Kazakhstan is on the right side of history and on the right side of the kind of the overall global system. And sort of Russia is digging itself in, So it's a very, very kind of interesting situation.
Thank you. Okay, we've reached the midway point here, so I have to do our little promo spot. Once again, let me recap the debate today on the Majlis podcast. We're talking about Kazakh-Russian relations and how they've been affected recently, but especially by Russia's war in Ukraine. Today, I am joined by William Courtney, a former U.S. ambassador to Kazakhstan and Georgia, who is currently an adjunct senior fellow at the RAND Corporation and executive director of RAND Business Leaders Forum. Azamat Junusbai, also originally from Kazakhstan, but currently a professor of sociology at Pitzer College in Claremont, California, whose work focuses on social stratification, welfare state attitudes, and public opinion about political and economic inequality in the post-Soviet Central Asia. Nargiz Gasenova, originally from Kazakhstan, but currently a senior fellow and director of the program on Central Asia at Harvard Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. Again, I'm Bruce Pannier, host of the Majlis podcast and author of the weekly Central Asia and Focus newsletter. Ambassador, how serious is this that you've been following Kazakh-Russian relations, obviously, for 30 years since Kazakhstan became independent? How serious is this in comparison with any other strains you've seen in relations between the two countries?
Well, we've seen a number of strains over the years, but none of them has amounted to anything close to the kind of strains between Moscow and Tbilisi or Moscow and Kiev. So, for example, in 2014, President Putin said that Kazakhstan really had never had statehood until President Nazarbayev helped create it. And that Kazakhstan, he said, should remain in the greater Russian world, which he said had developed industry and advanced technology. The Kazakhstanis were quite offended by that. And so the next year, President Nazarbayev hosted a 550th anniversary of the Kazakh Khanate and invited leaders from other Central Asian countries, Turkey and elsewhere. So that was to emphasize that Kazakhstan was not just a dependent or a dependency throughout its history. And President Nazarbayev was fundamentally correct about that. So I don't believe this current situation is going to be too serious, in part because Russia is overextended now with its war in Ukraine and most recently its threats against Lithuania for cutting off some rail transport between Russia and the Kaliningrad Oblast. So Russia has to be careful about not overextending itself. And I think at the current time, Kazakhstan has a fair amount of room for maneuver. while Kazakhstan's multi-vector foreign policy has been sort of more tilted toward Russia. That's been the strongest vector. Now Kazakhstan will probably try to rebalance a little bit as Russia's getting weaker, maybe stronger ties with China, probably some stronger ties with Turkey and with the West. With the West, it will be important that human rights issues be improved in Kazakhstan if that vector of Kazakhstan's foreign policy is to be improved. There have been calls in the West for independent investigations of the January shootings, for example, by security forces and other things. There continue to be political prisoners locked up, Jambal Mamai being one of them, but others as well. So the West, I think, is beginning to take a firmer stance on human rights, respect for human rights in Kazakhstan.
Bruce, if I could add something to my response from before, one clear pattern that I've seen in response to the war in Kazakhstan society was actually a renewed interest in the study or in learning and mastering Kazakh language by Kazakhs who are Russian speakers, right? So there are lots of urban Kazakhs who grew up speaking Russian, who went to Russian schools, and honestly speaking from personal experience, never even felt uneasy or embarrassed about not knowing Kazakh. It was just a fact of life. And now, just through social media, through personal contacts, I'm seeing more and more reports of people who would never before you could imagine them trying to learn Kazakh or doing something about it, people joining these Kazakh speaking clubs, right? People feeling uneasy, uncomfortable with the fact that they only speak Russian or speak Russian and English perhaps, right? And there is resurgence of interest in the study of Kazakh, again, among some Russians actually as well, but also Russian-speaking Kazakhs. And that is clearly in response to Russia's aggression in Ukraine. And I also wanted to sort of agree with what Ambassador Courtney said. I think that maybe the interesting dynamic now is that, yes, what happened in January, it was CSTO, not Russia, as President Toqaev correctly pointed out, but also, as you yourself said, we all know that CSTO is an organization that is very much Russian-led. And I think there was fairly widespread perception among at least some observers in Kazakhstan that Toqaev was going to be in some debt to Putin after this, right? Even though, of course, it would never be formally acknowledged. But because Russia now is overstretched and is in this horrible war, right, against Ukraine, what debt, if any, Kazakhstan now has toward Russia? I think that dynamic becomes more complicated, right? Because position of Russia in the world, position of the Kremlin now is just not what it was before February 24th, right?
Can I add to that, Bruce?
Please.
Yeah. So on the one hand, yes, of course, Russia is overstretched, and I also don't think that it can afford really jeopardizing decent relations with Kazakhstan. And it goes both ways. We cannot jeopardize our good relations with Russia either. But it can still do some damage. It can still kind of create problems for Kazakhstan here and there. So, and I think some of it we do see, and some of it we will see more of that as well, because the relations are not, they're not in a good shape. And I fully agree with Ambassador Courtney that it is time for a kind of serious, good, meaningful conversation between the West and Kazakhstan on human rights. And there is an opening on the Kazakh side, because Toqaev has initiated political reforms. He talks about the importance of human rights. He promised to unveil a reform of the police, security sector, of the judiciary in September. So the timing is good. I think there is an opening.
Okay, great, thank you. And that, this is perfect, because I was hoping to get a comment from all of you on to follow up on the points that we've just been hearing about that. hearing that, for years, countries outside the CIS, Western countries for the most part, have been urging all of Central Asia, not just Kazakhstan, but to diversify its export-import routes, make new connections so it wasn't so dependent on former Soviet states and Russia in particular. Now, we know that Kazakhstan and Russia have a 7,000 kilometer long border, so there's no possible way of deconnecting from Russia. But at the same time, given Russia's dilemma right now in Ukraine, there are projects that have been around for a while. The Asian Development Bank's Central Asia Regional Economic Cooperation Project for connectivity, Belt and Road, we heard mentioned, and this is another one. Do you see that this is kind of a watershed moment for Kazakhstan in some ways, where it finally accomplishes what so many people have been recommending and is pushed to diversify not only its trade, import, export routes, but also its political connections, its diplomatic ties to other countries at this moment, and somehow when this kind of shakes out and it's all over, that Kazakhstan might actually be seen as more of a sovereign state and less of a being kind of in Russia's pocket, as some people have hinted, and that would be the outcome of this. I mean, can you talk about the connections they're making and how this could lead to a change in Kazakh-Russian relations in the future? And we'll start with Ambassador Courtney, please.
Bruce, thanks. You are correct. So the rebalancing, which Kazakhstan is likely to undertake now in its multi-vector foreign policy, probably is something that should have occurred a little bit before. But to give you an example, Turkey. So after Kazakhstan became independent 30 years ago, Turkey thought that it could play a big brother role, maybe something like what Moscow had played before. But President Nazarbayev and other Central Asian leaders said that they did not want to cast off one big brother and gain another. But now I think we see that Turkey has more opportunity, except that turmoil in Turkey, internal turmoil in Turkey, gives it less possibility to reach out with an effective foreign policy in Central Asia. Now, that may change in the future, but right now, that's the current circumstance. So for Kazakhstan, reaching out more to China is certainly a sensible approach. China has a lot of investment potential in Kazakhstan, but there is nervousness in Kazakhstan about Chinese taking over agricultural areas, for example, or having too much influence in Kazakhstan. There's a fair amount of suspicion. So that, too, is an issue. And then the West, of course, has always strongly supported the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Kazakhstan. But the West is far away. And the West is now, of course, preoccupied with the war in Ukraine. So the West may not be able to be quite as helpful. And of course, as I mentioned, the West is going to want Kazakhstan to improve its respect for human rights. So it is not so easy for Kazakhstan to do this rebalancing, but it is something that would be sensible. Nonetheless, from an economic standpoint, the Russian relationship has to be so important for Kazakhstan. A challenge for Kazakhstan is that the Kremlin makes so many decisions that jeopardize Russia's economic interests, as, for example, the war in Kazakhstan, or the war in Ukraine, which has led to Western sanctions, and those impose collateral damage on Kazakhstan. So not until the Kremlin gives higher priority to economics in Russia is it likely that Kazakhstan's economic relationship with Russia is going to improve as much as the potential for it exists.
Thank you. Nargis,
yes.
Do you see Kazakhstan distancing itself a little bit from Russia as an outcome of this?
I don't know what would be the right verb to describe what's going on, but I think there is some partial decoupling from Russia. And we see it with the top elites, for example. And, it was common for Russian and Kazakh elites to serve on each other's, kind of boards in big companies, and we see this changing, and it's partly due to the change of the kind of the political transformation in Kazakhstan. So Kulibayev is no longer, on the board of Gazprom, and kind of the now I'm forgetting the name of the Russian guy who was on the head of, on the board of Alfa Bank, for example, and now that we know that Russian banks are closing in Kazakhstan. So I think there is a little bit of decoupling at the level of the kind of the elites, which is very important because that's the political economy of the country, right? So, but the kind of strong ties will be there, but rebalance. Okay, I fully agree that multi-vector foreign game, kind of the multi-vector foreign policy, the diversification, that has been the name of the game for 3 decades, right? But now there is this kind of big push for doing more, and you hear about these new opportunities. Kazakh officials talk about it, Kazakh businessmen talk about it, business people talk about it. These new opportunities are opening up to do something new, to maybe catch on, kind of on these opportunities that are opening because they're closing in Russia. And Toqaev keeps talking now about kind of Kazakhstan becoming a buffer market, whatever that means. The buffer market that would allow for kind of developing new north-south, east-west trade economic corridors. I would love to learn to understand better, what he means by this buffer market. But he talked about it in St. Petersburg. He talked about it again online at this BRICS Plus meeting organized by China. So, but the kind of so far the situation is okay. So far, it seems Kazakhstan has been managing, but indeed, as Ambassador Courtney mentioned, there is a fear of secondary sanctions. It's not ensured that we'll be able to manage this situation well, and so basically, yes, there is uncertainty. So there is a good amount of enthusiasm and a good amount of fear in the country.
Okay, good. And on your note too about this buffer zone, I don't know so much about that. I agree, it's kind of vague, but it's worth mentioning, of course, that President Toqaev was in Iran recently, and he was there as the first train from Kazakhstan was going through, carrying sulfur, I believe, on its way to Europe through Iran and Turkey. So they already are establishing one route. And Azamat, also, I want to get your
yes, of course. I think that there are a couple of things happening at the same time. On the one hand, for sure, among the population, right, there is a growing anti-Kremlin, anti-Russian sentiment just because of the crimes Russia is committing in Ukraine, right? So that's undeniable. It's happening. At the same time, the 7,000-kilometer border, right, the demographic facts on the ground, those things cannot be changed, and you can see maybe one helpful thing to look at in the future is what happens with this proposed new nuclear power station on the Balkhash Lake that Russia has been very heavily pushing on Kazakhstan, right? So far, Toqaev has spoken in support of that, despite significant opposition in Kazakhstan among experts and a lot of people to this new Russian nuclear power station, because people are fearful that allowing Russia to go ahead with the construction of this power station will again create a lot of new dependency on Russia in Kazakhstan. But perhaps the decision about this power station will be an indicator, right? Just yet another indicator that will allow us to see whether Kazakhstan really is able to distance itself from Russia. Because I am somewhat pessimistic about Kazakhstan being able to really distance itself from Russia as much as I personally would like to see, for example. And also, so if you think about the alternatives, right? So China is committing horrible crimes, right? Chinese government against ethnic Kazakhs in Xinjiang. And, obviously those things are not talked about widely in Kazakhstan, because I think if this was something that people began to discuss at length on television, it would create a lot of unrest, right? And so But that's there, and the government knows about it, and that certainly puts a damper on, the cooperation with China. And Turkey perhaps is looking like a more attractive option, but as Ambassador Courtney said, they are having a lot of their own trouble right now. But you have, on the one hand, growing anti-Russian sentiment, but also evidence of continued dependence on Russia and Russia's strong influence on Kazakhstan, as we see in the construction of this nuclear power station, the proposed construction.
Let me ask you this question, and it's also for everyone, but I'll start with you, Azamat. How important is dealing with Russia to President Toqaev right now? I mean, remembering that, of course, after the January unrest and his order to use lethal force to restore order, he was pretty unpopular. And he still hasn't resolved this crisis from January, his internal crisis, and yet he has this other foreign dilemma with Russia. I mean, how important is it for him to, for instance, to have the public stance that he has, where he's seen to resist kowtowing to Moscow over everything they want?
Well, I think it is extremely important, right? Because the perception after the January events among many observers locally was that Toqaev was doing Putin's bidding, right? That this was yet another example of Russia having its way in Kazakhstan. And of course, Toqaev sort of denied this, and the Kazakh government denied this and said, no, this was CSTO. And I think they actually had this triumph when the Russian or CSTO forces rather left, right, within a few days of arriving, right? Because a lot of people, I was actually in Almaty at the time, a lot of people were very nervous that the foreign soldiers were going to linger. And the fact that they all picked up and left, I think, was a sort of triumph for Toqaev, for sure. But for him now to be able to sit next to Putin on the stage and say that we do not recognize Lugansk and Donetsk People's Republics is essential. I mean, it's the right thing to do. Like Professor Kasyanova said, he is sort of, I think, on the right side of history here. Kazakhstan is on the right side of history, but also domestically, in terms of domestic politics, if any Kazakh leader sits there and says, we recognize these territories, what does this mean for northern Kazakhstan, right? So he is walking a tightrope, incredibly delicate situation, in my opinion. And I think, like Professor Kasyanova said at the beginning, I think he's doing a good job in a very difficult situation.
Thank you. Ambassador Courtney, your opinion on this, how much the domestic problems Toqaev faces influencing his public stance toward Russia?
Well, the comments that he made at Spieth in St. Petersburg probably helped him at home overcome some of the unpopularity of his decision to call in the Russian forces, CSTO forces, in January. So in this case, I think President Toqaev has benefited from those St. Petersburg comments. But there will still be a lot of suspicion, especially if there's no independent investigation of the January protests and the shootings by security forces and others. Ordinary Kazakhstanis, I think, are pretty upset about how that turned out. In some ways, that's worse than what Lukashenko did in 2020 in Belarus and Minsk. So President Toqaev may be in a slightly better situation now, but Kazakhstanis are expecting more. They're expecting a transition out of the Nazarbayev dictatorship into something in which the political process is more open. And so far, I think most Kazakhstanis, and certainly in the West, we see this as more of an elite reshuffling rather than a more open process. President Toqaev talks about reforms, if you will, and things that he wants to do to open the political system. But when we look on the ground at how political opposition leaders are being treated, and the refusal of the government to accept independent investigation of the January events, it doesn't look like there's really much of a political opening. So I think the fundamental political instability in Kazakhstan, if you will, remains as a result of those tensions. And the foreign affairs will not have too much impact on that, despite the partial relief that President Toqaev may have received because of his strong comments in St. Petersburg.
Yes. Nargis, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yes. Well, an independent investigation is very important for kind of building trust between the state and society. In Kazakhstan, that's for sure. But at the same time, we don't know what's the level of political feasibility of such an investigation is at this moment. And the political situation in Kazakhstan is still quite delicate. There is this purge going on. Nazarbayev and his people, his associates, are being squeezed out of the system. But of course, there is some resistance and the possibility of a revanche. And Toqaev didn't come with his own team to, so that's something he needs to build up. He didn't have proper legitimacy. He was a successor, an appointed successor, and the 2019 presidential elections were quite controversial. That's why he needed this referendum, it seems, to create some kind of popular legitimacy. So it's a very, very complex situation. I don't see him as a big Democrat, but I think he genuinely wants to kind of create a better governed place, and to have more to build up the foundations for sovereignty, kind of these domestic foundations for sovereignty. And one phrase in his March address stood out for me. He said, nobody in this uncertain world, nobody really cares about us, but us. We need to take care of ourselves. And I think his sort of vision is that, we need to to build more cohesion on the basis of more social justice, on the basis of more equally distributed economic benefits, economic well-being. And also the strengthen the Kazakh identity, and we see a lot of effort in this regard. Now there is a big project to rewrite the history textbooks, create multimedia, and so on and so forth. So building up this Kazakh identity, strengthening it is part of the agenda. So I think it's important to understand what is possible at this point of our history. And I don't know. I don't think any of us has the correct answer and very, very super clear understanding.
Bruce, if I may add a few things. It seems that in Kazakhstan today there is a lot of enthusiasm, right, for new Kazakhstan that Toqaev talked about. At the same time, one has to ask, well, is it possible to build new Kazakhstan on the foundation of half-truths, right, or perhaps outright lies about the events in January, right? As Professor Kasanova just pointed out, there is definitely a squeeze on Nazarbayev's sort of relatives and inner circle. They're being pushed out of their positions of power. However, it seems there is a constraint, right? There really has not been an honest reckoning on part of the Kazakh government with who was behind the events in January. Names were not really named. So a lot of the actions now taken against Nazarbayev's relatives and inner circle they're just basically business decisions, right? They're not in any way tied to what happened in January. And it appears that Toqaev's ability or Kazakhstan's ability, Kazakh government's ability to build this new Kazakhstan, right, is constrained by what appears to be an agreement to not say certain things, not state certain facts about what happened in January. And as a result, they are trying to do this with sort of this new Kazakhstan undertaking with, perhaps one hand behind their back, right? It's just they are not, by not being able to openly and explicitly talk about fundamental political reform that's required, judicial reform that's required, law enforcement reform that's required, it constrains their ability to bring about meaningful reform. And there's a huge danger to Kazakhstan in that, right? Because these half reforms, hopefully they will succeed, but who knows? But they can't, it seems that they are based on whatever agreements have been reached. They cannot seem to say explicitly what actually happened in January, but without those truths, they're hostage to the current sort of situation.
Good point. Thank you for saying that, Qasym-Zhomart. This could be a discussion easily, but we do have to wrap it up. But I offer everyone a chance to make any last comments they want to make about something first. So please, if you want to, Nargis, it sounds like you want to say something.
Well, indeed, it looks like the situation is very, very complex, and it looks like Kazakhstan is trying to rebuild the house, while the neighborhood is on fire. But maybe that's the only situation when you can really undertake this big of a project. But we'll see. I do hope that we'll emerge from it better and stronger.
Ambassador Courtney, any last comments?
So 30 years ago, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there were a lot of predictions by various experts around the world that the countries, the new republics, would not maintain their independence, that a Turkestan might be created that would include all the Central Asian countries, that some or all of them might end up being absorbed by Russia because they would not be able to maintain their independence. Well, Kazakhstan especially has shown how a country that suffered under the Soviet Union, suffered grievously under the Soviet Union, including the famine in the 1930-31 period, has been able to become not only a country that maintains its independence and sovereignty, but to become a real international leader in non-proliferation, energy cooperation, other areas. So Kazakhstan has been, in many ways, a remarkable success over the last 30 years. But now it is at a cusp where its people expect more, as people expect a more responsive and more honest government than it has had. And so Kazakhstan really has to make some fundamental decisions about how to go forward in ways that maintain and draw on good relations with neighbors, but also enable it to build a stronger society with greater political and social legitimacy.
Thank you. Okay, and Qasym-Zhomart.
Yes, I think despite this being a very scary time, a very dangerous time for Kazakhstan, it is also a hopeful time that there is a possibility of renewal, political renewal, and for one, I personally am optimistic about New Kazakhstan. Of course, the barriers are immense, dangers are very real, but it's a hopeful time.
Excellent. That is a good comment to leave on. So a huge thanks to my guests today, Qasym-Zhomart Tunisbayev, Nargis Kasenova, and Ambassador William Courtney. And thank you to Nathan Shoemaker, our Majlis podcast producer in Washington, D.C. I'm Bruce Pannier, host of the Majlis podcast and author of the weekly Central Asia in Focus newsletter. You can subscribe to one or both by visiting Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's website at rfarl.org. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back next week.